In the grand tapestry of rock history, few friendships shine as quietly and deeply as that between George Harrison and Bob Dylan. Two musicians from different worlds, one a Beatle who redefined pop, the other a poet who redefined language, drawn together by something more profound than fame: truth. And yet, in one of the strangest moments of their friendship, Bob Dylan once described a George Harrison guitar solo as perfect, even though most fans, critics, and even George himself thought it was terrible. This is the story of that solo. A single, imperfect moment that revealed everything about George Harrison's humility and Bob Dylan's unique sense of beauty. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were unraveling. George Harrison, long overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney, had begun to seek freedom outside the band. He found it in a quiet friendship with Bob Dylan, the one person who understood what it felt like to be both idolized and misunderstood. Their connection began in 1968, when George visited Dylan in Woodstock, New York. While John and Paul chased experiments in London studios, George sat on Dylan's porch, strumming guitars and trading songs under the open sky. There were no egos, no producers, no crowds, just two artists stripped down to their essence. Harrison later said, "What I felt with Bob was like a brotherhood. He wasn't a Beatle and I wasn't a prophet. We were just musicians." That friendship would resurface again years later, in the most unexpected way. Fast forward to 1971. George Harrison was now a solo artist, preparing for something no Beatle had ever attempted: a massive benefit concert for Bangladesh. The lineup was legendary: Ringo Starr, Eric Clapton, Billy Preston, and Bob Dylan himself. But before that, there was another project that bonded them: the concert for Bangladesh rehearsals and Dylan's early 1970s comeback sessions. George was invited to play slide guitar, an instrument he'd recently mastered and turned into his signature voice. One of the songs they worked on together was "If Not For You," a tender Dylan ballad that George had already covered on his own album, All Things Must Pass. It was during one of these sessions that the terrible solo happened. The recording was loose, informal, no pressure, no perfectionism. But George's slide guitar part didn't quite land. It was shaky, out of tune in places, and lacked the precision of his usual playing. Even George seemed embarrassed, calling it a bit rough around the edges. To most, it would have been a throwaway take. But to Bob Dylan, it was something else entirely. When asked years later about that moment, Dylan smiled and said, "That was perfect." George didn't play for effect. He played what he felt. It was a remark that puzzled fans for decades. How could something technically flawed be called perfect? But to Dylan, who had spent his entire career defying perfection, that solo captured the essence of music itself: honesty. It wasn't about how clean the notes were. It was about what they carried. In George's hesitant, sliding notes, Dylan heard vulnerability, the sound of a man trying to speak truth without hiding behind technique. For Dylan, that was purity. For George, it was just being human. George Harrison had always believed that real art wasn't about complexity. It was about connection. He once said, "I prefer a few notes that mean something to 1,000 that mean nothing." That philosophy defined his slide guitar style. Where Clapton played with fire and speed, George played with restraint and emotion. Every slide, every vibrato felt like a breath, deliberate, fragile, spiritual. And yet George never saw himself as a great guitarist. He once admitted, "I'm not a technical player, I play intuitively from the heart." That humility, that lack of vanity, was exactly what Bob Dylan admired most about him. When Dylan called his messy solo perfect, he wasn't praising the performance, he was praising the person. A man who could let go of ego, who could make mistakes and still mean every note. The collaboration between Dylan and Harrison continued through the years. They formed the Traveling Wilburys in the late 1980s, alongside Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne, and Roy Orbison, where the same spirit of imperfection ruled. It was a group of legends who, for once, didn't care about charts or critics. They laughed, played, and embraced mistakes as part of the magic. In one interview, Dylan reflected, "George had this thing. He didn't chase perfection. He chased peace." And maybe that's why their bond lasted so long. While others sought to be immortal, George and Bob sought to be real. Today, that terrible George Harrison solo lives on in bootlegs, documentaries, and fan discussions. Some hear the flaws, others, the feeling. But no matter how it's remembered, that moment between George and Bob remains one of the most revealing in rock history. Because in a world obsessed with perfection, two of the greatest songwriters of all time agreed on something radical. That imperfection, when played with sincerity, could be more beautiful than any polished performance. As George once said near the end of his life, "All I ever wanted was to play something true." And in that one trembling, uneven solo, he did. Bob Dylan saw it. He called it perfect. And maybe he was right. Sometimes the greatest music isn't flawless. It's fragile. And that's what made George Harrison's solo so powerful. It wasn't about showing skill. It was about showing soul. Because perfection fades. But truth echoes forever.